Hi, I'm Adam Toon. I'm an associate professor in philosophy at the University of Exeter in England.
Okay, so that's perfect. You teach philosophy because I was curious, why do you teach philosophy? How did you get into the game of philosophy?
Well, I originally studied maths and theoretical physics at university for a while.
That sounds lucrative.
But
I mean, more than philosophy.
yes, yeah. Do you know, there's a few times when I'm asked to give advice to students or about these career choices, and I look back and think actually the naivety that I had back then was. Probably a good thing, because I think, like a lot of these big life decisions, if I'd really sat and weighed up the pros and cons of my choices, I might not have made the choice I did. And I'm very lucky that it's worked out. It's worked out fine in the end, but it's not especially easy route. And there are plenty of points in most people's career who do this sort of job where it looked like it might not work out. And yeah. So I did. Physics and theoretical physics and maths, and I think at a certain point, just I think a lot of the reason I was interested in physics was sort of big questions about life, the universe, and everything, and of course. The more you move along in the sciences, the more sort of specialised and they can become, and to some extent, you can sort of feel like you've lost sight of some of those big questions that you're interested in, or at least that's how I began to feel. And so I was very lucky that I got the chance to study the history and philosophy of science, actually, rather than sort of philosophy. And so I was able to do that for the final year of my degree and really enjoyed it, and was lucky enough to get a scholarship to go to graduate school and carry on doing it. Yeah.
Was there a particular when, for instance, growing up, were you always thinking about, you liked kind of the big questions, or is this something that developed later?
It's a good question. I don't. I think I just love learning about things. Really, I know that sounds a little bit bland, but I was really lucky that I had a lot of great teachers at school, and certainly until you're 15 or 16 in the UK, you can be doing lots of different things. So I remember loving history, and then heading straight down, and we had a electronics club at school, and I got to sort of build little robot circuits and so on, and the teachers were kind enough to put in time after school to let us do that, and I love writing stories and so on. So I think it was more just the sort of breadth of things that I enjoyed. But then, at the age of 16, you pretty much have to decide within the UK system, are you, where are you specialising? You've got to pick 3 or 4 things, and if you're looking ahead, as I was, and thinking, well, what university place would I like to get? To do the sciences, that sort of narrowed down my options, and meant I couldn't really carry on doing humanities subjects as well, so I ended up doing maths and further maths and physics and chemistry and so on. And I think looking back, my school didn't teach philosophy. It wasn't, I doubt I'd have known what philosophy was as a subject, really, as a even before university, really. But I do remember we had classes which I can't remember what they were called. If they were they might have been called something a bit elliptical, like personal and social education, or something like that, where we talk about democracy, or sort of, I suppose, citizenship is what people sometimes might call it. And I certainly remember a few of those debates where I was sort of very bloody-minded in sticking to a particular principle and defending it against the rest of the class. And I look back now and I think that was probably a sign of things to come, really. I was just sort of very, very awkward kind of kid who would, lay down the law and what I thought first off, and then just defend it, despite it being obviously, obviously far too rigid or what have you. So yeah.
How did you transition? So philosophy is one thing. So one of the things, the reason your recent book jumped out at me is because I think this issue of what consciousness is, what constitutes the mind, how do we figure out what it is? The fact that we still can't do that in this incredibly technologically advanced, sophisticated world, especially in the first world, I feel like we still haven't locked down what exactly is consciousness? What is the mind? What are we talking about when we're thinking about our own identity as an ego being? Why did the mind start to attract you in college, and then we'll start wandering into what the hell's going on in this field?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I didn't. So when I started, when I moved away from studying the sciences, I originally studied what's called history and philosophy of science, and at the university where I was studying in Cambridge, there's a specialised department in history and philosophy of science, and there's a separate philosophy department. So a lot of what I worked on first of all was what would be called philosophy of science, so questions about the nature of scientific method, if indeed there is such a thing, key concepts in the science like causation or laws of nature and what they mean, questions about what kind of attitude we should take to scientific theories. So should we believe in things we can't see, like atoms and genes, for instance, and if we should, why? And so a lot of my early work in philosophy was in philosophy of science.
And it sounds like, I'm curious, tell me if I'm wrong, a lot of that sounds like why do we believe what we believe in science, and how do we know what we know in science?
Yes, I think that's right. And it's so, I mean, my specific topic that I wrote my first book on was about scientific models. And one of the things that's so interesting about models in science is that they're false, and the scientists know perfectly well that they are false. In other words, the world is, to use William James's phrase, a blooming, buzzing confusion, and it's typically far too messy and complicated to describe as it is, and so we usually have to simplify and idealize it in various ways. We use models, and so I was interested in that and comparing that in certain limited ways to the way that, say, paintings or fiction sort of simplify various things in order for us to understand them. But I think more generally, I think your characterization is just right, and I think the answer to sort of how I got interested in the mind from that starting point in philosophy of science is that the nature of the mind is not only important. I mean, it's not only an extremely interesting, important question in its own right, of course, but it also sits at the heart of the way we think about knowledge and our relationship to the world. And such a lot of the questions that exercise us in, for instance, the questions we ask about the sciences, have a very similar starting point. So to go back to something I mentioned earlier, one key question in philosophy of science is what's often called scientific realism. So the question of, roughly speaking, whether we can take our scientific theories to be true or not. And part of that,
Wait, can I stop you for 1 second?
Yeah, carry on.
I've noticed just like a minute ago, it sounded like a buzzing kicked on.
Right, yes, that is the plumbing in the Victorian building that I'm in, I'm sorry to say. It's become increasingly loud in the last week or so.
It's so weird. I would expect usually there's like gurgling or whatever, but it's just a humming of the plumbing.
It's a high-pitched, and it's a problem because it's the toilet near the seminar room and underneath my office, and so people can be giving a talk, and all of a sudden, if someone flushes it makes this noise. So I will be on to the maintenance team about it as soon as possible.
And you're right, it does go away. So it really is whatever the whole process of flushing the water and everything coming back to equilibrium. Okay.
It is. I'm in a very idiosyncratic Gothic Victorian house here that's been repurposed into a university research centre.
Okay, sorry. In scientific realism, go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. So I suppose, roughly speaking, the way that you can express the issue there is, of course, that lots of us in our particular society are very comfortable with the idea that the world is, as it were, radically different to the way it appears to us. You know, that we're comfortable with the thought that, well, the world as it appears to the senses, what Wilfred Sellers called the manifest image of the world, is very different to the world as it really is, as presented with the sciences. So, you know, the classic example, you know, a table seems to me as if it's solid and it has a colour and a particular shape and so on. But I know that in some sense, what it really is lots of tiny things that perhaps are waves or perhaps are particles or perhaps are both in mostly empty space and so on. So there's a particular sort of divide between the world as it seems to us and the way that we take it to be based on the results of the sciences. And, you know, arguably that division is something that's in the form that it takes for us a feature of modern culture that's quite distinctive, and what it seems to involve, what it seems to be a question about, of course, is the relationship between mind and world. So we have, I think one of the reasons I'm interested in the mind is we have a quite a compelling picture of the mind, which is, roughly speaking, that it is an inner world within us, and the key question then is, what is the relationship between that inner world and the world outside? And a lot of the questions about knowledge more generally are questions about whether our inner world is an accurate picture of the world outside, whether there really is a world outside, or if we all are brains in a vat, and so on. So I suppose the answer to the question of why I got interested in mind is not only that I think it's, as you mentioned, it's fascinating in its own right, but it also lies at the heart of the way we understand so many of the questions of modern philosophy.
So it's interesting that the separation from inner world and outer world, and I saw that in some of the talk about the recent book. Just as you said earlier, these kind of fictions that we know they're not real, but we use them, like the table is solid. That is, you know, it's a useful tool or model for me to imagine that the table is solid, even though the scientists tell me there's more space than solid there. This idea that there is an inner world separate from the outer world, we feel that compellingly, but isn't that the inner world seems also like a complete, it's also an illusion. So what isn't it? Because we can't pin our finger on where the consciousness is, where the mind is, and if we can't sort of hold it and look at it and say this is real, it's just another fiction. How do we deal with that?
Well, yeah. How do we deal with it is a good question. So I think that what I would say is we need to be sort of careful in how we phrase some of the questions that we ask about the mind. So here's a kind of a very common view, which I think is a mistake, and then I'll get on to the question of how we sort of deal with it if it is indeed a mistake. So I think there's the starting point for the book that I just wrote is what's often called folk psychology. So in other words, all I really mean by that is it's our ordinary day-to-day common sense talk about the mind. So the thought here is that in everyday life, usually without even noticing what we're doing, we say that people have certain beliefs and certain desires, and we use that to explain, why is that chap standing at the bar, raising his hand, and sort of, waving it over at the other person with their back to them? Well, because he wants a drink, so he's got a desire for a pint of beer or whatever it is. And he has various beliefs, like that you can get a pint of beer in a pub, and that the person standing behind the bar very often is able to help you with that, and so on and so forth. So one way to, as it were, start to demystify some of these questions about the mind, or at least make them more concrete, is to reflect on the fact that in ordinary life, typically there's a sense in which we're not especially confused about the mind, or at least we're experts at saying what other people's beliefs and desires are, often even when we don't know them. They're just a chap who's come in the bar where we work to get a drink, and we haven't met him before, and often on the basis of fairly limited clues. In this case, he's just standing there waving his hand, and that's it. So I think one way in which we should try to, as I say, not see the mind as something too, as it were, otherworldly or strange, is to just remind ourselves of the role that concepts like belief and desire and so on, and emotions play in everyday life, in which we're often experts at deploying them, or at least, we get it right a lot of the time.
And wait, can I complicate one thing about because I love your example. A lot of the things are judgments, are quote unquote judgments, or stories we might tell about that man at the bar, come out of, we're not even quote unquote conscious of them. So this inner world, do you have to then parse this inner world into, well, the things I reason about and think about in the spotlight of my attention, and the things that happen intuitively, unconsciously, to help me navigate around, which are almost come out of the body more than they come out of the conscious mind?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think that, as you say, I mean, typically when we, as philosophers put it, when we attribute mental states, so when we say what people want or think or what have you, we don't have to go through a long process of thinking. You wouldn't last very long working in a pub if you had to say, okay, there's someone standing over there, they're waving their arm, I wonder what beliefs and desires that could token, and so I think the way that I would put it is, it's a kind of, we're engaged in a shared public practice of a certain language for talking about people, which includes talk about their mental states. And yes, very often, like with a lot of our language use, I blurt things out before thinking what I'm saying all the time. We take part in those practices very fluidly, and now sometimes, of course, it takes a lot more explicit reflection, and that's one of the things that people do in a therapy session, or it's one of the things that they do chatting with their friends in the pub about why another friend is behaving so strangely lately, or that we do sometimes have to reflect explicitly, but in many cases it's fluid and automatic. Okay,
that's perfect, because I just wanted to set up, are you setting up are there additional quadrants of things on which you are reflecting consciously, and things that happen as a matter of whatever, we're genetically programmed to be able to work with people socially this way, and we're not always aware of it. So you're like, oh no, that can all be included. It's sort of these fluid boundaries.
Yes, I mean, perhaps we'll get on to this. I would want, I think, to be a bit careful about moving from us being very automatic and very habitual or accustomed to doing this to attributing it to say genetic heritage. I think an alternative explanation is simply that we're taken into a particular culture at an early age and taught its language and its norms, and humans are social creatures, and we're able to adopt those norms and conform to them fairly smoothly. And a lot of social life is like that. Yeah. But yes, there is the more general point. I think it's absolutely right that in a vast majority of cases, we talk about other people's minds without even noting that's what we're doing. and we rely on assumptions about other people's minds and their beliefs and desires all the time. Why is that guy trying to push in front of me? Oh, because he really wants a drink too. That I don't have to go through much of a process of reasoning to see that's happening for me to want to elbow him out the way and get there before him, or something like that. So you can tell I'm giving a very bad impression here of the English at 3:30.
Yeah, boy, this bobbing and jostling and just jamming. It sounds like you're terrible at queuing in that country.
No, we all order via an app now, of course, so it's not like this at all. But yeah.
Okay, but right. So folk psychology, right. Where we just yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose what I want to say is if we then so it seems like most people will accept that that's part and parcel rather of social life. Now, the one way to set up the key questions I want to ask about the mind is, but how do you really interpret that? Right? What's really happening when you say that someone wants a drink or believes they can get a drink in a bar or what have you? What are you really saying about them? And what makes what you say true or false? How could you go wrong? And I want to say there's a particular kind of standard, very natural interpretation of what's happening, which is found an awful lot in the literature, which is to say, well, what all that talk is really, what that folk psychology is really is, well, it's a bit like psychology in the ordinary sense. It's a kind of, in this case, a rudimentary theory about people's inner world. So if I say, well, why is he waving his hand around furiously? Because he wants a drink. I'm giving an explanation of that person's behaviour. And that's a little bit like the way in which a scientist might say, explain the properties of the table in terms of these hidden things called atoms and electrons. I'm explaining, on this view, I'm explaining the person's external behaviour, the waving of the hand, by reference to an inner world, which contains things like a desire that's causing, along with lots of other mental states, is causing this behaviour. So there's a way of understanding this folk psychology, this common sense view of mind, which says it's a set of hypotheses about people's inner world, their inner machinery. And I in the book I call that view Cartesianism, although it's I'm in a sense taking the label there and perhaps being a little bit unfair to poor old Descartes, but everyone is about Descartes.
Right.
So it just shows how influential you are as a philosopher if people keep using and abusing your name like this. So, but the general idea here is that you take our ordinary conception of mind to be claims about an inner world, about inner machinery, and sometimes that can go wrong, but sometimes perhaps it goes right. So now, and the thought, of course, is that if that's what folk psychology is, if it's a kind of rudimentary theory about our inner machinery, well, like any scientific theory, it could be wrong.
Right.
And so you have, as it were, kind of two camps on this, not evenly divided, but two camps. You could say, okay, if folk psychology is a theory of our inner machinery, is it true or is it false? Some people would say it's true, and they find, they want to find beliefs and desires and other mental states in insiders in some sense, and we could perhaps come back to what that might mean. There are others who say we don't have beliefs and desires, and that folk theory is false.
Well, the model you gave, again, sort of the pop science thing is, hey, the table. The one thing about the table one is you say, well, a scientist comes and says there's an inner world of the table in which there are these molecules and then atoms, but I can show these to you. I can go down and show you these things pushing on each other. And I feel like some of the neuroscientists, psychologists, the people in this field have turned to science and materialism to say, well, we can show you the same thing, like that famous study everybody deploys about your brain, quote unquote, decides to do something before you are aware that you're doing it. And then you make up a story about why you're doing it. And this is a famous materialist example of how everything that you're thinking or the decisions you think you're making are really determined by some other machinery running in your brain.
Yes, I mean, I think of course, there's everyone will agree, I suppose, I certainly would agree that the brain is enormously important for enabling us to do what we do. I guess where the shouting begins is sort of how you interpret what's happening there.
Okay.
And in particular, in this case, do you think that you will find beliefs and desires in some sense in the brain? So do you think this folk understanding that we have is going to prove to be by and large true, subject to some correction here and there, or do you think, as some authors will say, that it's just radically false? It's like the belief in the mind is like the belief in witches or phlogiston and so on, and we're just, really we're going to have to eventually wean ourselves off it. We're going to have to start talking about, I can see that guy's waving his arm and his neurons are firing in such and such activation pattern. I better pour him a pint,
right?
And we'll get away from this way of thinking of beliefs and desires and so on. Yeah. So, and I think just to say where I stand in this, I think the main idea that I want to push is to say, that really that's just the wrong way of understanding the folk, or it's the wrong way of understanding what we're doing when we talk about the mind, I think. So what I want to say, I think, is that it's true that we talk about the mind as if it were an inner world. We talk about people as if they have inner sentences that capture their beliefs, for instance, or as if they have inner pictures that, that they're reasoning with and so on. But that is a useful fiction. In other words, that I think what we're doing there is we're speaking, as it were, metaphorically. We're saying this person behaves as if they have these inner representations of the world, but they don't really. So that's and what that whole inner world is, I think, is a metaphorical projection of the outer world, of human languages, pictures, diagrams, and so on, that give us this very rich, that this external world of human culture gives us a very rich resource to draw upon for making for making sense of people, and we draw upon it metaphorically by constructing this idea of the mind as an inner world. That's the so I think that's the mistake that the Cartesian view that I mentioned earlier makes. It thinks the folk are serious. It thinks they're committed to this idea that there is this inner world, and that if it turns out that inner world doesn't exist, well then the mind goes with it. And I think that's not the right way to understand our concept of mind.
So the obvious disappointment with the idea you've set up, which I think is very compelling, is that we want there to be a clear delineation between what is real and true. I mean, again, it's been going on for a long time. As long as we want to figure out which things are real and true, and which things are unreal and untrue. This idea that these things are fiction, I think some people find it unsettling, because if we introduce the idea that some things that seem very true and that I take as true and real and that I have to are actually fictions, well, then sometimes people throw up their hands and say, well, then all things are fiction. If I can never know, quote unquote, whatever the truth is about this world around me, because I'm operating through limited senses, I'm operating through these fictional models in my mind. Well, that's terrible. It sounds terrible. And then also, how do I prove this? If everything is fictional, if I'm just creating models of a reality that's sort of not fully graspable, then what hope? What hope do we have?
Yeah. So I see where your earlier question was coming from about sort of where do we go from here. That can I try to convince you that in fact it's Cartesianism that should lead you to be despairing in that way, and that in fact the fictionist view that I mentioned should lead you to be a lot less despairing.
Sure.
I think that if we go back to what I said earlier about problems of knowledge and of epistemology, and in particular those that that arise from the the rise of the sciences in the early modern period, that it's really, I think, it's the, if you adopt a Cartesian view of the mind, if you start to think of it as an inner world of representations, then it's really that view that raises a lot of the skeptical worries that you were just putting across so nicely, right? It's really, once you start to convince yourself, something that isn't obvious at all, that your mind is an inner world, and there's this gap between your inner world and the world out there, that a lot of the really worrying skeptical challenges arise for you. You can start to worry, is there really a world out there? Am I just trapped in here on my own? Are there other people, or are they all just robots? So I'd rather think it goes the other way round, that it's really a lot of the deep skeptical challenges that plague much of modern philosophy, and we shouldn't take this too far. There are worries about knowledge that aren't traced. It can't be traced back to Cartesianism, but I do think that, as it were, once you accept Cartesianism, you raise all of these problems, like the problem of the external world, the problem of other minds, and so on, that really are not problems. So I think, the fictionist view is to say this: look, there are other people, and they behave in certain ways. We make sense of their behaviour by talking as if they had these inner representations, inner sentences. I can make sense of why someone's reaching for the kettle to make a cup of tea by saying, well, it's as, they want a cup of tea. Well, it's as if they've got a little sentence saying, make a cup of tea, that's guiding them. It's almost as if they had a little crib sheet written down that they could look at and say, make cup of tea, right? But there aren't these inner sentences. Really, as it were, people's minds are much, on this view, in the fictionist view, people's minds are much more mundanely open to us than they are in the Cartesian view. There's no need to make these shaky inferences to an inner world. You can very often see in the pattern of someone's behaviour what their beliefs are, what their desires.
But I see your establishment of this Cartesian idea that if we trap ourselves in a sort of, we figure out, oh, I am a constant unchanging, or I am a knowable I, and everything else is an unknowable out there, including the other I's, that creates the problem. Are you just talking about sort of holding these things, holding self and I a little less tightly to be able to establish, well, the only thing I know for sure, I think, therefore I am. I know I'm a self because I'm thinking, and now I can't know anything. I can't see into anyone else's brain cavity. So then, boom, I'm left with the problem.
So I let me try and see if I can sort of put it more clearly. I think it's a mistake to think. So I think, the I think therefore I am idea is to, as it were, to take our own thoughts as being what's most immediately knowable to us, and of course for Descartes, that's a kind of starting point then to build via the thought of God, by the idea of God to the external world. Now, I suppose what I want to say is I'm on the one hand, it might seem more a more worrying view, because I'm not convinced that we have that sort of privileged access, as it's often put, to our own thoughts. I think sometimes other people are a better judge of our beliefs and desires than we are. And they're a better judge because sometimes they're a better judge of our behavior. We can kid ourselves.
And you mentioned that therapy thing. Again, you say things that you think are true, and then reflected back to you, someone tells you, well, you've said this, and you've said it again and again, and you clearly think it, but there may be something else going on. And then you feel oh my God, how come I couldn't think that about my thoughts or my feelings?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's many cases. I mean, so an example I give at the book, you say to yourself, well, I think it's really important to look after the environment. And then you wander around chucking your crisp packets and chocolate bar wrappers and so on all over the floor. And now, do you really think it's important to look after the environment? However many times you say that to yourself, however many times you say it, as it were, silently to yourself, well, no, I don't think you do have that belief. I think, or pick up design, I can say to myself, I really have a burning desire to be a professional football player. Although that ship has sailed for me at the age, I think. But, I can say that to myself. If I never get up and practice, my free kicks, if I never make any effort to get fit or whatever, do I really have that desire? I'm not sure. So just even in quite mundane cases, right, outside of a therapy room, we can kid ourselves, and what I mean by that is we can have certain patterns of behavior or even certain feelings, but we can make mistakes about what those patterns of behavior and feelings mean for our beliefs, our desires, and lots of other mental states. So I think that, so that's not to say that I don't think that we have it. It's not to say that I don't think that there aren't some aspects of mind where we do have a kind of privileged access. So, if you tread on my toe, I feel something that you don't. If you tread on it really hard, then I probably won't be able to stop myself making you aware of it by yelping or whatever. If you only do it slightly and I want to be polite, I might manage to control myself enough that you don't become aware of that. But I am. So in other words, sensations, of course, are an example where we do have a different, we could say access, although that's slightly misleading, but we do feel them in a way that someone else doesn't. But I think we can move too quickly from that feature of something like a pain in my toe to thinking that, well, because we have that kind of immediate felt access to something like a pain in our toe, well, then the mind as a whole is something like that. The mind as a whole is something to which we have a kind of special access, and other people don't, and then we begin to worry about whether we could ever access other people's minds and so on. So, and I would want to stop that slide. Right, there are certain things like a pain or what have you that have that quality, but there are lots of other things that come under our concept of mind, all the way from beliefs and desires to emotions to character traits and so on, where the story is a lot more complicated.
What does the idea of mental fictionalism do that the idea of I am a solitary consciousness in one meat bag and cannot properly know reality or other people? What does thinking about these things as fictions? One, I played devil's advocate and said, it feels bad to say, well, I'm uncertain about things, or I need to hold this a little less lightly. Some people really want to be sure that they're exploring what's absolute truth, and that can be difficult to know. How does mental fictionalism open up new possibilities for interaction or thinking about self?
So can I just one point that you mentioned again there that I realised I perhaps ought to just say something more about, and then I'll try to come to that question. I mean, one thing is, I realise, of course, that this term fiction and fictionalism is quite loaded, and it can have now. In a way, I want to just sort of plead not guilty to some of that. That it is to some extent a term of art, and it's for that reason something that's quite hard to avoid. Sometimes I have the feeling that if you were to phrase a lot of what I'm trying to say here in slightly different terms, so if I was to say, as the title of the book says, that mind as metaphor. Mm-hmm. So if I talk in terms of metaphor, sometimes that seems rather not to have quite the same worrying overtones as fiction. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this term fiction, I mean, I've talked about scientific models as being akin to works of fiction, and there in particular, you have to be careful, right? Because it can seem as if you're inviting a wholesale kind of skepticism.
Right. You're not just suggesting we're all just
knowledge.
It clearly carries the weight that, well, we're all just making up stories and these stories don't have any reality. Yeah. And we all have competing stories and none of them have any competing. You can't compare or contrast them in any way because they're all just made up.
Yeah. And that's I think that's very much not the case. Right? So for instance, a lot of what I would want to say, or that people more generally have said about fictions in scientific modeling, for instance, would come as no surprise to a practicing scientist at all. Right? It comes as no surprise to people who are engaged in the sciences that they have to make all sorts of simplifying assumptions when they want to understand a complex system, that they have to treat it as if it was simpler or more idealized or what have you. So to some extent there, the term fiction can seem unnecessary. And in my own work, the only reason, or the main reason for drawing on this, for using the term fiction at all, is really because I think that in scientific modeling, there's a key element of imagination that's akin to the writing fiction.
Okay.
So in other words, I think very often it's perhaps even philosophers who are guilty of this as much as anyone else, that you can think that science is kind of straightforwardly in the business of describing the world as it is. Whereas very often there's a key imaginative move where you realize, as I mentioned earlier, the world as it is far too complicated and messy for you to just, you could, if you wanted, try to write down a big long laundry list of all the facts about the system. You know, an example I've used before, you may remember, as I do, school classes where you would try to predict what happens when you bounce a lump of plasticine up and down on a spring. And, you know, typically when I remember being asked to do that, the spring was all bent out of shape because, you know, this had been used in classes for 10 years or what have you, and the plasticine's all lumpy and everything. And you think, well, how on earth do I go about, you know, maybe you're doing the experiment in front of the window and the wind's blowing in and making this stand that you've hung this spring on wobble about, you know. But of course, what the teacher will say is, well, no, treat the plasticine as if it were a point mass, and treat the spring as if it had no mass, and as if it obeyed Hooke's law, and so on. So it's part and parcel of the sciences that we have to use imagination in that way to imagine the world as being different to the way that it is. And what I want to say is that's not recognizing that it is not in itself a skeptical move. As I say, I don't think that would come as any surprise to the scientists. Right. It's not that, you know, they're saying, oh, well, this surface really is frictionless. And I'm coming along and saying, no, you're wrong about that. They're perfectly well aware that they're operating with a claim that in fact is false, but just useful for some purposes. And so that's one thought that very often it's not that I'm asking people here to revise their opinion. It's the key point here is just to notice that in many domains of inquiry, we're aware, as it were, of what the truth is, but we know we have to adopt some other claims that are not true for some purposes, like for simplification and prediction and so on. And the other point to add to that, of course, is that it's not just that anything goes. You know, some simplifications and idealizations are worse than others. You know, if I was to model that lump of plasticine on the spring as an object in free fall, I'd give much worse predictions than if I was to model it as a simple harmonic oscillator, for instance. So, and again, as I say, I think people doing these things in the sciences are perfectly well aware of what they're doing. I think it's often when we approach those practices with a slightly too simplified idea about knowledge, that it's truth or nothing, something like that. You know, it's either you've got to get the truth or anything goes. And actually, the reality is quite a bit more complicated.
You've been very gracious with your time, and I have a closing question, and you can duck it or engage angrily with it, which you probably won't. we talked at the very beginning, we talked a little bit about desire. So the person's in the pub, they're waving their hand. We think that means that they want something. And science oftentimes is investigating things, but behind what they're investigating or why they're investigating it or what effects they hope would come from investigating this, those all wade into this murky world where philosophy sort of gets closer to religion and gets close to all the other science and philosophy get closer to all the other fields, which is, what the hell are we doing this for? Is anything in your explorations of consciousness and mind get to the question, there's these questions that some philosophers deal with and some don't. What ought we to be doing? These ethical questions, because this seems very couched in, and I like it. It's measured in, well, what is the behavior? How do we practice this? How do we know this? The oughts and the shoulds that come out of ethics. How does that fit into the stuff you do?
It's an interesting question. I suppose in the way that you asked it, you saw that you could anticipate that that I might stall for time, like I am doing. But that's not so. I think that the view of the mind that I've been talking about is not simply, as it were, a theoretical position on people. It is, for instance, a fairly individualist position. It sets up a barrier between us and the rest of the world. And I don't think, and there are other authors who've written about this, I don't think that is, as it were, neutral with respect to ethical or political questions. So, our view of ourselves, a relationship to other people and to the world, is not simply a theoretical matter for philosophers, for scientists, what have you. It also has implications for how we think about ethics and how we think about political philosophy. Those are not my fields, but in the project that I want to engage in next, following on from this book, they're going to come, I think, much more to the fore. Yeah.
Wait, so all you're going to do is leave me with a cliffhanger?
This is philosophy, that's unfortunately that's how it is. No answers.
I am excited about it, and I lied because you answered that one so smartly. I do have one closing thing. I've done a lot of exploration of.
Gosh, I should answer this one less smartly.
You're right. Just
that's the consequence.
with a total lack of thought and nuance, and without reasonable arguments. This issue with mind. So this is probably more of a personal question, because I've always been interested in ethics and philosophy and religion, and recently started to explore kind of what's called nihilism in some branches of Buddhism. But really, if you get into it, it's not really nihilism at all. But it is a sort of, the problems all result from you thinking you have a fixed mind and that there is a stretch out into the present and the future that you have a handle on. And really, there's a way in which to sit in the moment. How have you looked when you've gone looking at either philosophers or religions or ideas that, well, the problem is a fixation on a set ego, and that if you let that go, there's some refuge, there's some bottom point at which you can settle into in the present. Does any of that help, or how have you wrestled with that at all, and how does it fit in, and what do you think about that stuff? I know that's a gigantic.
Yeah. So I mean, I certainly wouldn't count myself as an expert at all on lots of the ideas that you mentioned, but I think perhaps one way I would put it is in the debates in which I'm engaged in. One of the things that I'm trying to resist is what you might call a reification of mind, and perhaps that speaks to some of what you just said. So the move that takes the mind to be an inner world is, as it were, making mind into an object, a mechanism. In fact, it's taking a vision of the world that became extremely influential, of course, in the scientific revolution, and it the mind is, as it were, reified to something that is an object and that is inner. Now, of course, that can change, but nevertheless, it seems as if it's making. I think one way to put it would be it's making something which is a whole, messy, complex pattern of behavior, which is often conflicted and for a certain purpose, reifying that in the moment to say, we may have a very conflicted pattern of someone's behavior, but we make sense of it by saying they have this belief. Right. And that in that is to go back to the case of scientific models, is a kind of simplification of a blooming, buzzing confusion that is other people. And we can't really, at least in the position we're in at the moment, I think, in our own culture, we probably can't do without that. It's very hard to see how you could engage in social life without doing something like that. Nevertheless, I think we need to be aware of what it is that we're doing. We do that, and perhaps a little less obviously than in the case of scientific models, but still, I think that we can bring ourselves to be aware of what we're doing when we do that through philosophical inquiry, and that's part of what I'm interested in doing.